The tent is still dark when Noah wakes. The air is sour with wine. Cloth hangs loose. A father has been exposed, sons have reacted, and one sentence is about to leave his mouth that later generations will drag far beyond its place in the story. But the first shock in Genesis 9 is not only the curse itself, it is the distance between what Noah says and what history later claimed he said. In the text, the curse falls on Canaan. In later centuries, men would load that sentence onto whole peoples who are never named in the curse at all. They would carry it to markets, ships, plantations, and pulpits. They would use it to stain Africa with a judgment the passage never gives. To understand how false that is, the story has to be taken back from the slogans and returned to the world where it began. That world opens after catastrophe. The flood story in Genesis is told as a kind of reset, not because human evil was slight, but because it had become normal. Violence had filled the earth. Corruption was not a private failing here and there. It had become the weather of human life. In that setting, Noah appears not as a flawless hero, but as a righteous man in his generation, a man who still walked with God while the society around him was coming apart. The ark he is told to build is described with unusual care, almost like a memory preserved in wooden measure. Long, wide, and deep, it is made to endure judgment, not to conquer the sea. It does not sail toward adventure. It survives a world unmade. 8 human beings enter that vessel: Noah and his wife, Shem and his wife, Ham and his wife, Japheth and his wife. All later peoples, in the logic of Genesis, pass through that one narrow door. The flood waters rise, the fountains of the deep break open, the rains fall, and the old world disappears under judgment. Months later, when the ark comes to rest in the region of Ararat, the story does not rush, it waits. Birds are sent. The ground must prove itself again. At last, the dove returns with a fresh olive leaf, a small sign that chaos is giving way to inhabitable earth. Then comes blessing. It is important to hear that before the later controversy. God blesses Noah and his sons, all 3 sons, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The covenant that follows is also spoken broadly. The rainbow is not hung over one branch of Noah's family and withheld from another. It is given as a sign that the Creator will not again cut off all flesh by flood. If one is going to make claims about divine favor and disfavor from this chapter of Genesis, that opening fact cannot be avoided. Ham stands under the same post-flood blessing as Shem and Japheth. He is not marked out there for racial inferiority. The text does the opposite. It gathers the whole surviving human family under one command and one mercy. That matters because Genesis is not telling a tale of separate origins. It is pressing the unity of mankind very hard. After the flood, there are not many starting points. There is one family. Later differences of language, land, custom, and appearance arise within that shared human story. Whatever else the Bible will say about nations, it does not begin with separate creations arranged on a ladder of worth. It begins with common descent and common accountability. And yet the man who came through the flood is still a man of the earth. Noah plants a vineyard. He drinks from its wine. He becomes drunk. The hero of survival is suddenly vulnerable, ordinary, even humiliatingly so. That too is part of the realism of Genesis. Deliverance from judgment does not erase human weakness. The new world carries the old human heart into it. One family saved from the waters will still have to learn what honor, shame, restraint, and power look like after catastrophe. So the story narrows from the scale of mountains and deep waters to the inside of a tent. It is one of the Bible's sharpest turns. A chapter that began with blessing over all flesh moves toward a scene of exposure within one household. And from that household scene will come one of the most abused ideas in religious history. Before the later arguments are even touched, the listener has to feel the gravity of that abuse. A text about one family crisis was expanded into a theory of race. A curse aimed at one line was stretched across a continent. The words were not merely misunderstood. They were recruited. The only way to break that spell is to slow down and listen to the passage as it actually speaks. Who acts? Who is named? Who is not named? What is clear and what remains debated? Because once those questions are asked honestly, the old claim that Africa was cursed in Noah's tent begins to fall apart under the weight of the text itself. And once it falls apart, another picture begins to emerge, one older and stronger than the distortion. Africa not at the edge of the biblical story, but running through it from near the beginning. Chapter 2, Noah lies uncovered in his tent, and Ham, the father of Canaan, sees the nakedness of his father and tells his two brothers outside. Shem and Japheth take a garment, walk backward, and cover Noah without looking on him. Those are the basic movements of Genesis 9. The drama is brief, almost severe in its economy. No speeches, no explanation of motives. Just an action, a report, an act of reverence, and then Noah's waking words. That brevity is one reason the passage has been fought over for so long, because the text says enough to create moral weight, but not enough to satisfy every later question. What exactly was Ham's offense? Some readers take the scene in its plainest sense. Ham saw his father in a state of shame and chose not to guard that shame, but to expose it further by telling his brothers. In a world where family honor mattered deeply, and where the father's dignity carried real social weight, that act would not be small. It would be mockery at the point of vulnerability. It would be the refusal of protective respect. On that reading, Shem and Japheth do not simply perform a household courtesy. They restore an order Ham has violated. Other readers have suspected something more than a glance. In parts of the Torah, language about uncovering nakedness can function as sexual euphemism. Because of that, some have wondered whether Genesis 9 hints at a graver offense, perhaps involving Noah's wife or some deeper violation of household boundaries. Still others have tried to explain why Canaan, rather than Ham, becomes the object of Noah's curse by suggesting that Canaan himself participated in whatever happened. Though the passage never states this directly, these readings are attempts to account for features of the story that feel unresolved. They may help explain why the reaction is so severe, but they remain attempts. The text does not unfold the whole psychology of the event. What the text does settle is simpler and far more important than many later readers were willing to admit. When Noah wakes and knows what his youngest son has done to him, he does not say, "Cursed be Ham." He says, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." The line is repeated and intensified in relation to Shem and Japheth. Canaan is named again and again. Ham is mentioned in the narrative as the father of Canaan, almost as though the reader is being prepared for the name that will matter. But the curse itself lands on Canaan. That is not a marginal detail. It is the point at which whole racist systems later had to wrestle the passage away from its own wording. There is another fact equally clear. The text nowhere identifies skin color as part of this scene. It says nothing about blackness, whiteness, or bodily features passed from Noah to his descendants as signs of moral status. Those ideas entered later, carried in by societies already invested in hierarchy. Once they enter, readers begin to see them where the text never placed them. But they are absent from Genesis 9. Entire doctrines of racial inferiority had to be imported into the passage before they could be claimed from it. The phrase "servant of servants" has also been used too casually, as though it gives a timeless sap of human worth. In the Bible, however, such language often speaks of subjugation in history, the lowering of one people before another, not the creation of an eternal biological order. Noah's words function like an oracle over future relations between lines of descent. They are not a laboratory description of race. They are not permission slips for kidnapping. They are not a divine charter for empire. And even if one wanted to take them as a prediction of national humiliation, the prediction must still be kept tied to the people actually named. That takes us directly to Canaan. In the world of Genesis and the books that follow, Canaan is not Africa. Canaan refers to the peoples of the Levant, the lands east of the Mediterranean, that later become central to Israel's story. This is where the distortion becomes impossible to ignore. The curse was taken off a Levantine line and spread onto Africans whose names are not under the curse at all. A passage about one branch of Ham's household was made to condemn every branch. That is not close reading. It is theological violence done by misreading. There is a quiet irony here. The very chapter later used to divide humanity actually begins from human unity. One father, one family, one shared blessing after the flood. Then, from within that family, one line receives a curse that belongs to a specific future. To transform that into a doctrine of racial destiny is to flatten the story and erase its limits at the same time. So when the old phrase, the curse of Ham, is repeated, it is already mistaken before any argument about history begins. The Bible does not give a curse of Ham in Genesis 9. It gives a curse on Canaan. That difference may sound small to ears trained by centuries of careless repetition, but it changes everything that follows. It changes geography, it changes history, it changes the moral use of the text. And once that correction is made, the next chapter of Genesis begins to open a world far larger than the old distortion ever allowed. A map of peoples in which Ham's descendants are not defined by curse, but by places, nations, cities, and histories of immense consequence. Chapter 3, Genesis 10, is sometimes called the Table of Nations, and that title is useful if it is taken with care. This is not a modern census, not an ethnic chart in the scientific sense, and not a neutral atlas. It is an ancient biblical map of the human world as Israel came to understand it, a theological geography that traces peoples back to the sons of Noah. Even so, it is one of the most remarkable chapters in the ancient world for the way it imagines humanity as related, branching, and spread across lands. But the origin is one family. Difference appears, but not as a denial of kinship. Ham's sons are named as Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Those names matter. Cush is commonly associated with regions south of Egypt, often linked with Nubia and the Upper Nile world, roughly the area of modern Sudan and parts of Ethiopia. Mizraim is the usual Hebrew name for Egypt. Put is often connected with Libya or the North African regions to Egypt's west. And Canaan belongs not to Africa, but to the Levant, the strip of land that later stands at the center of Israel's conquest traditions and political struggles. Right there in the family record itself, the geography already blocks the later racist reading. Ham's line is not one people. It is multiple peoples in multiple regions, and the cursed branch, Canaan, is not the branch settled in Africa. The importance of Mizraim alone should make the old slander look absurd. Egypt in the Bible is many things at different moments: refuge, threat, granary, imperial power, house of bondage, place of wisdom, place of temptation, place of shelter. But it is never presented as the product of a racial curse. Egypt is one of the great civilizations of the ancient world, towering in architecture, administration, writing, medicine, and memory. The biblical writers knew its weight. They felt it politically and culturally for centuries. To place Egypt under a narrative of inherent degradation is not merely cruel to the text, it is blind to the world the text itself inhabits. Cush is no less significant. The Bible often treats Cush as a known and formidable land, far enough to evoke distance, yet close enough to enter diplomacy, war, prophecy, and praise. Cushite figures appear in the narratives without any hint that their ancestry carries divine disgrace. On the contrary, the Cushite world often appears with dignity, power, and real presence. When later readers forced Ham's descendants into a story of inherited inferiority, they had to ignore not only Genesis 9, but the whole later texture of Scripture. Then there is Nimrod, a descendant of Cush. Genesis describes him as a mighty man on the earth, a mighty hunter before the Lord. His kingdom begins with Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From there, the story reaches toward Assyria and cities such as Nineveh. The text does not say outright that Nimrod built the Tower of Babel, though later tradition often associated him with that proud early world of city building and concentrated power. What matters here is the simple fact that a line traced through Cush stands at the center of the first post-flood centers of civilization in the biblical imagination. Ham's descendants are not pushed to the margins. They are woven into the rise of kingdoms, languages, and urban life. Canaan, meanwhile, is listed with locations tied directly to the eastern Mediterranean world: Sidon, Heth, the Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Arkites, and others. This is the stock of peoples Israel later encounters in the land. Here again, the Table of Nations acts like a witness against abuse. If one wants to know where the line of the curse belongs, the chapter answers. It belongs in the land of Canaan and in Israel's later relationship to those peoples. That does not make every difficulty in Israel's conquest traditions easy, but it does prevent the passage from being stretched into an African racial prophecy. The Table of Nations also prepares for Babel. As languages divide and peoples spread, humanity becomes visibly diverse in speech and settlement. Over long stretches of time, real human populations adapt to their environments. Climate, sunlight, food systems, and migration shape bodies as well as cultures. The Bible does not offer a biological treatise on skin color, and it never tells us the complexion of Adam and Eve. The familiar image of a white Adam and a white Eve belongs far more to later European art than to the Hebrew text. The name Adam is tied to the ground, to Adamah, the earth from which he is taken, not to a modern racial category. Modern biology, for its part, does not support the moral fantasies later attached to color. It shows that skin pigmentation is adaptive, that darker pigmentation is ancient in the human story, and that lighter skin emerges in some populations much later under different environmental conditions. None of this can be pressed into the Bible as if genetics simply proves Genesis, but it does expose the poverty of the old claim that darker skin could be a visible badge of divine curse. Nature itself does not cooperate with that lie. So Genesis 10 leaves us with a world more interesting and more demanding than the racist reading allowed. Ham's descendants are founders of regions, not objects of contempt. Their line includes Egypt and Cush, names the Bible treats with seriousness from beginning to end. Canaan is distinct, and that distinction matters. If the Table of Nations is heard properly, the false curse of Ham begins not just to weaken but to collapse. And once it collapses, the Bible's relationship with Africa can be seen in a new light, not as a shadow story attached to judgment, but as one of the great threads running through the drama of Israel, and later the Church, chapter 4. If the Bible is read only through later European paintings, or through the assumptions of the Atlantic world, Africa can seem like a distant backdrop, a place visited at the edges of the real action. But the scriptures themselves do not speak that way. Their world is tied to the Nile, to desert roads, to Red Sea routes, to Nubian strength, to Egyptian courts, to trade from the south, and to the movement of armies and refugees across lands that bound Africa to the Levant more closely than modern maps sometimes suggest. Africa is not a decorative margin in the biblical imagination. It is one of its living neighbors, and often one of its major players. Egypt stands first because it is impossible to remove it from Israel's memory. Long before Israel became a nation in the land, Egypt was already ancient. By the time biblical events take shape, the Nile Kingdom had built monumental centers, developed scribal traditions, organized labor on astonishing scales, and cultivated sciences of calculation, healing, and administration that impressed the ancient world. The Bible does not pause to praise pyramids as a historian might, but it speaks from a world in which Egypt's prestige was obvious. That matters because one of Ham's lines is not pictured as primitive or rejected, but as advanced, feared, admired, and repeatedly entangled with the covenant people. Even the movement from Noah to the nations hints at this wider horizon. The descendants spread, languages diversify, cities rise. The Bible treats this not only as dispersion, but as the beginning of political worlds. Different peoples form identities, customs, and power centers. Over time, those migrations also shape visible human variation. There is nothing morally charged about that. It is simply what human populations do across geography and generations. People do not emerge from the Bible as sealed racial castes. They emerge as families becoming peoples, peoples settling lands and lands shaping life. That is why the old question, if all humans come from one pair, how did skin color appear, has to be answered without panic and without fantasy. The Bible leaves Adam and Eve's skin color unstated. That silence should be respected. Later artists filled it according to their own settings. Genetics and anthropology suggest that darker skin is deeply rooted in early human history and well suited to high UV environments, while lighter pigmentation developed later in some regions with lower sunlight. However one relates that science to biblical theology, it certainly does not produce a chain of value from light to dark. The ancient text never does that, and the natural world does not do it either. The Bible's own concern is different. It is concerned with whether nations honor God, whether kings do justice, whether pride builds towers and empires, whether the poor are crushed, whether covenant is kept, whether violence fills the earth again. Those are the moral categories. When prophets address Cush or Egypt, they do not speak as though those nations occupy a lower tier of creation. They speak to real peoples before the same sovereign God who judges Israel too. It is also worth noticing how often biblical memory preserves African and African-adjacent places, not as empty spaces, but as meaningful settings. The Upper Nile world is not vague wilderness. The South is a place from which envoys can come, where rulers can rise, where soldiers can be known, where trade can move, and where God's reach is not absent. The mention of Cush in prophecy often carries distance, yes, but not contempt. Sometimes it carries wonder, sometimes warning, sometimes promise. This wider picture helps when the story returns to specific figures. A Cushite can appear in the David narratives. An Ethiopian can rescue a prophet. An Egyptian princess can draw a Hebrew child from water. A queen from the south can test Solomon's wisdom. An official from the court of Candace can carry faith back toward Africa. None of these episodes works if Africa is imagined as cursed territory, standing outside God's serious dealings with humanity. The Bible keeps refusing that frame, and that refusal begins early. Ham's descendants are not introduced as a problem race waiting to be subdued. They are introduced as ancestors of lands and peoples the biblical writers knew well. Some of those peoples become enemies at times. Some become allies. Some become refuge. Some become instruments of judgment. Some join the people of God. That is how the Bible usually treats nations. It does not flatten them into permanent symbols. Their standing changes across history, and Israel's own standing changes too. Election is not racial vanity. It is covenant vocation under judgment and mercy. So when later interpreters turned Ham into a racial marker and Africa into a theological category of servitude, they did more than misquote Noah. They erased the actual Africa of the Bible, the Africa of courts and roads, dynasties and marriages, sanctuary and danger, worship and witness. They replaced a living set of histories with a myth convenient to power. To recover the text is to recover that world, and once that world is seen again, one of its largest features comes into focus. Israel's own story cannot be told without Egypt, cannot be told without African neighbors, and cannot be told honestly if those neighbors are treated as cursed by birth. Chapter 5 Abram goes down to Egypt because famine has struck the land. That is one of the Bible's earliest signals that Africa, in biblical memory, is not merely a place of exile or punishment. It can also be a place where life is preserved when Canaan cannot sustain it. The episode is morally tangled because Abram endangers Sarai through fear, and Pharaoh's house becomes entangled in the deception. But even here, the Egyptian ruler is not drawn as naturally corrupt. In some ways, he sees the wrong more clearly than Abram does. The story does not give the moral advantage automatically to the Hebrew wanderer. It allows the Egyptian court to expose him. Later, when Joseph is sold by his brothers and taken to Egypt, the whole scale of the relationship grows. Joseph descends as a slave and rises through suffering, false accusation, imprisonment, discernment, and policy into a place of immense authority. He becomes administrator under Pharaoh, not in some weak state, but in one of the most sophisticated governments of the ancient world. The famine narrative depends on that sophistication. Storage, taxation, distribution, transport, planning across years of plenty and years of want. These are not romantic details. They belong to the reality of civilization. And in that setting, a Hebrew becomes the means by which many lives are saved. Joseph also marries Asenath, daughter of an Egyptian priest. Their sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, are later counted among the tribes of Israel. That fact is often passed over too quickly. The covenant people are not imagined as a sealed blood chamber untouched by surrounding history. Egypt enters Israel's own family line. The same Bible later abused to defend racial purity quietly records interwoven ancestry within the people, through whom the promises move. When Jacob and his sons come down to Egypt, the land of Goshen becomes a place of settlement and growth. The memory of this period is not one simple note. Egypt is both cradle and house of bondage in Israel's imagination. At first it is provision, later it becomes oppression. That complexity matters. The Bible does not build its nations as cardboard. It knows that places can save at one moment and enslave at another. Yet even at the point of enslavement, the Egyptians are not treated as descendants of a curse, whose role is to serve others. They are the ruling power. The old racist reading reverses the actual social logic of the story. Moses himself is formed in that world. Drawn from the Nile by Pharaoh's daughter, raised in the orbit of Egyptian power, instructed in the knowledge of the court, he is a Hebrew deliverer whose mind and speech were shaped in part by African civilization. Even his name likely bears Egyptian echoes. This does not weaken his identity, it situates it. The liberator of Israel is not educated in cultural isolation. He is prepared within the house, from which he will later lead a people out. The story is full of irony, but none of it requires contempt for Egypt as a cursed line. In fact, Moses' formation inside Egyptian structures shows just how deeply intertwined the histories are. And when the Exodus finally comes, the departing company is not ethnically simple. Exodus remembers a mixed multitude going up with Israel. People joined themselves to this movement of liberation. Covenant identity would still have its marks and boundaries. But the road out of Egypt was not walked by one neatly sorted modern race. The people of God in motion were already more mixed than later ideologies liked to imagine. The same is true in Moses' household. Numbers 12 remembers the criticism raised against him because of the Cushite woman he had married. Whether this refers to Zipporah in a particular way or to another marriage has been debated, but the narrative force is not hard to see. Miriam and Aaron speak against Moses, and the Lord answers by defending him. Whatever social discomfort or prejudice lies behind the complaint, the text does not side with it. The divine response falls not against the Cushite wife, but against the rebellion wrapped around the criticism. In a tradition later twisted to degrade Africans, the Lord stands in judgment on those who challenge the leader over his Cushite connection. This whole cluster of narratives matters because it destroys the claim that African descent in the Bible carries a negative theological charge. Egypt shelters, instructs, oppresses, and shapes. Cush appears inside Israel's own leadership tensions. African-linked ancestry enters Israel's tribal life through Joseph's house. And through it all, the biblical world looks nothing like the later plantation sermon. There is no clean line running from Noah's tent to African servitude. There is, instead, a complex history of entanglement in which Africa repeatedly stands close to the center of redemption history. That center is not static. It moves with famine, court politics, migration, slavery, and deliverance. But as it moves, it keeps drawing Africa back into view. The story of Israel cannot escape the Nile. The lawgiver cannot escape his Egyptian formation. The covenant community cannot escape its mixed road out of bondage. All of this makes the later use of Genesis 9 even more grotesque. The same Bible that carries the memory of God rescuing slaves was turned into an instrument to bless slavery. The same Bible that shows African peoples woven into divine purpose was made to preach their supposed destiny of servitude. That lie can only survive if the actual stories are kept at a distance. Once the stories are heard again, it begins to die. Chapter 6, as Israel settles in the land and moves through the age of judges into monarchy, Africa does not vanish from the script. It remains present in rulers, envoys, marriages, military pressure, and prophetic imagination. The Queen of Sheba is one of the most striking examples. When she comes to test Solomon with hard questions, the narrative in Kings is not interested in reducing her to an exotic ornament. She arrives with wealth, intelligence, political stature, and the confidence to examine Israel's king for herself. Her visit is about wisdom and recognition, but also about the prestige of distant kingdoms paying attention to Jerusalem. Whether Sheba is located chiefly in South Arabia, the Horn of Africa, or in a network spanning both sides of the Red Sea, the episode belongs to a wider Afro-Arabian world of trade and royal exchange. Later Ethiopian tradition would remember her with even greater depth. The biblical text itself, at minimum, presents a southern queen whose dignity is beyond dispute. In the time of David and the prophets, Cushite and Ethiopian figures continue to appear. A Cushite messenger carries news in the aftermath of Absalom's rebellion. The detail is brief, but it shows again that such persons are not alien to the narrative landscape. More moving still is Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian in the book of Jeremiah. When Jeremiah is thrown into a cistern and left to sink into the mud, it is this foreign-born court servant who acts with courage and tenderness. He goes to the king, speaks up, gathers men and old cloth, and pulls the prophet out before. Later, the Lord speaks a word of protection over Ebed-Melech himself. In one of Jerusalem's darkest hours, when many in Judah prove faithless or cowardly, an Ethiopian becomes the man who preserves the prophet's life. Any theology that treats Africans as inherently debased must walk straight through that testimony and pretend not to hear it. The prophets also speak about Cush and Egypt in ways that combine judgment, realism, and hope. Amos can remind Israel that the Lord who brought them up from Egypt also moves other peoples in history. The point is not to erase Israel's calling, but to humble ethnic arrogance. God is not a tribal possession. Psalm and prophecy sometimes imagine Egypt and Cush in the orbit of worship, even naming them among those who will acknowledge the Lord. Cush will hasten to stretch out her hands to God. Rahab and Babylon. Behold Philistia and Tyre, with Cush. These lines do not turn every political relationship into harmony in the present, but they do open the horizon. The God of Israel is not assembling a future of one color and one bloodline. History presses in sharply during the age of empires. Assyria rises like a storm over the Near East. In that pressure, the kingdom of Cush appears not as a weak appendage but as a real force. The rulers of the Kushite dynasty, who at points held sway over both Nubia and Egypt, stand as major political actors in the 8th and 7th centuries before Christ. Among them is Taharka, named in the biblical narrative during the crisis under Hezekiah. As Assyria bears down, the mention of the king of Cush is enough to affect the military and diplomatic field. Scripture does not romanticize him. It simply treats his kingdom as consequential in the struggle of the age. That is exactly what the wider historical record suggests as well. Nubian and Egyptian power was still very much part of the great contest. even where the biblical writers speak critically of nations. They do not distribute criticism by skin tone. Egypt may be judged for pride. Cush may stand in warning or promise depending on the context. Israel herself is judged relentlessly when she trusts in horses, idols, injustice, or foreign alliances. The prophets are equal opportunity destroyers of vanity. Their categories are covenant fidelity and human arrogance, not racial ranking. That wider prophetic vision matters because later generations often read the Bible as though its world were morally arranged around Europe's concerns. It was not. The text emerged in a world where Africa and the Levant were neighbors, rivals, kin through old genealogies, and partners in movement and trade. When prophets speak of Egypt and Cush, they speak into live political realities. When poets imagine them in the reach of Zion's God, they imagine a redeemed future large enough to include them. The old curse theory cannot survive long in that atmosphere. It is too small, too provincial, and once the script moves into the New Testament, the pattern does not weaken. It intensifies. Africa remains not merely nearby but active at crucial moments. The child Jesus will be carried into Egypt. An African man from Cyrene will bear the crossbeam behind him. An Ethiopian court official will receive the gospel on a desert road and carry it southward. By then, the idea that Ham's line stands under divine rejection should already be gone. But if it has somehow survived that far, the gospel narratives themselves are ready to finish what Genesis 10 began. Chapter 7 night falls over Bethlehem under threat, and before the child Jesus can even speak, Africa becomes refuge again. Joseph is warned in a dream. Herod is hunting for the boy, so the Holy Family goes down to Egypt. The move is practical, urgent, dangerous, and loaded with memory. The place once remembered as the house of bondage becomes the shelter of the Messiah. The pattern from the patriarchs returns in a new key. When the land turns hostile, Egypt preserves life. Christian imagination has often lingered over the manger, while giving too little attention to that early exile. Yet the Son of David, in the vulnerability of infancy, survives under African sky. When the gospel story reaches its darkest public hour, another African figure steps into view. Simon of Cyrene is seized from the crowd and made to carry the cross behind Jesus. The scene is brief and brutal. Rome has no interest in symbolism. It simply needs a burden moved. Yet the Gospels preserve his name and, in one account, the names of his sons, Alexander and Rufus, as if the early church knew this family. Cyrene was a North African city with a substantial Jewish population. Simon is not treated as a curiosity. He is drawn into the center of the Passion at the moment when disciples have scattered and violence has narrowed the road. An African shoulder is placed under the wood of execution. Then comes Pentecost. Jerusalem fills with pilgrims and residents from many lands, and among those present are visitors connected with Egypt and the regions of Libya around Cyrene. The outpouring of the Spirit is heard in many tongues, a moment that answers Babel not by erasing languages, but by crossing them. The Christian movement does not begin as a monochrome local sect. It begins as a multilingual eruption in a city crowded with the nations. Africa is present at the birth cry of the church. The Book of Acts continues the pattern, with quiet force. In Antioch, one of the great early centers of Gentile mission, the list of prophets and teachers includes Simeon, called Niger, along with Lucius of Cyrene. The exact background of each figure cannot always be pinned down with precision, and Niger in itself must not be made to carry more than it does. But taken together, the Antiochene leadership clearly reflects a church more varied than later imagination often allowed. The missionary impulse that will send Paul and Barnabas outward comes from a community already formed by crossing cultural lines. Most famous of all is the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8, a high official in charge of the treasury of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians. He is returning from worship in Jerusalem, reading Isaiah in his chariot, when Philip is sent to him on a desert road. The scene is one of the most elegant in Acts. because it joins scripture, longing, limitation, and revelation in a few swift movements. A powerful man is reading a prophet and cannot unlock the passage alone. A preacher is sent. Isaiah's suffering servant is opened. Water appears. Baptism follows. Whatever complexities attach to the eunuch's status under temple law, the story's movement is unmistakable. One who had reason to feel distance is brought near through Christ. That moment also carries historical resonance beyond the chapter. Long before much of Northern Europe became Christian life took deep root in Africa, in Egypt, in the Nile world, across North Africa, in communities that produced martyrs, bishops, theologians, monastics, and biblical interpreters of enormous importance. Acts 8 is not the whole explanation for that history, but it is a fitting seed sign. The gospel reaches southward early. Africa does not wait at the back of the line. The New Testament therefore continues what the Old had already made plain. Africa is not outside salvation history, not hanging on as an afterthought, and certainly not tagged with a curse that disqualifies its peoples from honor. The child Christ finds refuge there. The cross is borne there in part by one of its sons. The Spirit is received there in Jerusalem's crowd. Mission is advanced by leaders tied to Cyrene. The gospel rides back toward Ethiopia in the hands of a court official reading Isaiah. All of this becomes devastating evidence against the later theological fraud. How could the same Bible be used to teach that Africans were destined for servitude when its own narrative gives Africa shelter, witness, wisdom, leadership, and joy in redemption? The answer is painful because it is simple. Powerful societies rarely begin with careful reading. They begin with interests. Then they search the sacred text for permission. Once that happens, words are bent, names are blurred, and genealogy is weaponized. But the New Testament does not cooperate with that violence. It keeps placing African persons and places where they cannot be erased. Near Christ's childhood, near his death, near the church's birth, near the early spread of the gospel. By the time Revelation looks toward the final multitude no one can number, the logic is already in place. The nations are not ranked before the throne. They are gathered. Chapter 8 bad readings do not become powerful by accident. They become powerful because they answer the needs of power. That is what happened with the so-called curse of Ham. Long after the biblical world of Noah, Canaan, Egypt, and Cush had passed into memory and scripture, later societies searching for a sacred defense of domination reached into Genesis and pulled out what they wanted. They blurred Ham and Canaan. They ignored geography. They ignored the blessing after the flood. They ignored the positive place of African peoples throughout the Bible. They ignored the distinction between what the text states and what their economies demanded. In that act of refusal, a household oracle became a political weapon. The process was gradual and uneven. Not every age handled the passage the same way, and one should be careful not to pretend there was a single straight line from Genesis to the slave ship. But by the early modern period, especially as the Atlantic slave trade expanded, the distortion hardened into a usable theology. Europeans capturing, buying, transporting, and exploiting Africans needed more than profit. They wanted innocence. They wanted a story in which violence looked like obedience. Genesis 9, mutilated and misquoted, offered them that appearance. Once the theory was in circulation, it worked on several levels at once. It gave preachers a sermon. It gave merchants a moral anesthetic. It gave empires a providential gloss. It let Christians claim that bondage was not theft but destiny, not crime but order. That lie spread across the ocean with the trade itself. In colonies and plantations, in the Americas and beyond, people heard from pulpits that their chains had been foretold by Noah. A text that never cursed Africans was made to stabilize their enslavement. There are few examples in religious history more chilling than that. The cruelty deepens when one remembers the larger biblical setting. The God these preachers claimed as the sponsor of slavery is the God who hears Israel's cry under Pharaoh. The foundational political memory of the Old Testament is not the sanctification of permanent servitude, but deliverance from it. Israel is told again and again to remember that it was once enslaved. That memory is supposed to form justice, compassion, and restraint. To read the Exodus in the morning and bless the slave market in the afternoon required not only misreading Genesis, it required moral dismemberment of the whole Bible. Churches were not innocent bystanders. Some resisted slavery, and that must be said. But many accommodated it, defended it, or delayed opposing it until the prophets and habits had soaked too deeply into law and society. Biblical language was arranged to support ownership of bodies, control of marriages, theft of labor, sale of children, and lifelong degradation. The curse of Ham became one strand in a larger rope of distortion that included selective readings of Paul, false ideas of civilization, and a refusal to see Africans as full bearers of the image of God. The tragedy also fed on imagery. If Europe painted Adam and Eve in its own likeness, if holy figures were whitened generation after generation, then the imagination was already being trained before the sermon arrived. In such a world, readers did not merely hear that Africa was cursed. They could be made to feel that sacred history belonged naturally to one race, and only secondarily, if at all, to others. Art, empire, and theology began to reinforce one another, but the lie never fit the text. It could not. Ham was not cursed. Canaan was. Canaan was not Africa. Egypt and Cush were not under Noah's sentence in Genesis 9. Africans appear in Scripture as rulers, spouses, officials, worshippers, rescuers, and early believer takes refuge in Egypt. Simon of Cyrene bears the cross. The Ethiopian eunuch enters the joy of the gospel. Once those facts are held together, the whole ideological machinery begins to look less like interpretation and more like fabrication under pressure of greed. That does not erase the damage. False theology can leave wounds long after it has been disproved. It can shape school books, liturgies, self-understanding, and political habits. It can leave descendants carrying shame they did not create. It can leave others carrying superiority they mistake for tradition. This is why returning to the biblical text is not only an academic correction. It is an act of moral repair, and that repair requires honesty about uncertainty too. We do not know every detail of Ham's offense. We cannot force every biblical reference to Cush into a modern racial box. We should not pretend that ancient identities map neatly onto modern ones. But none of those cautions rescue the old curse theory. They simply make us better readers. The central facts remain clear enough to judge the distortion. The curse lands on Canaan. The geography points to the Levant. Africa's peoples are not defined by Genesis 9, and the larger biblical story repeatedly includes them with dignity and significance. When that is admitted, one last question rises. If the old lie is stripped away, what picture of humanity does the Bible actually leave us with? Not a world of ranked races, not a covenant of skin, not a divine endorsement of domination. It leaves us with one human family under one Creator, broken by sin, divided into nations, judged in history, yet still called toward a future where those nations are gathered rather than chained. And that future is not vague. The Bible closes with it. Chapter 9 by the time Scripture reaches its final horizon. The old curse has no place to stand. The Bible that opened with earth, breath, and the shared dignity of humanity ends with a multitude from every nation, tribe, people, and language standing before the throne and before the Lamb. That is not a decorative ending. It is the answer to every attempt to turn ancestry into destiny. The nations are there in their plurality, not dissolved into sameness, yet not arranged in ranks of worth. They stand together in worship. Whatever history did with Noah's words, Revelation does not allow the distortion to survive the end of the story. This is why the recovery of Africa's place in the Bible is more than a matter of representation. It is a matter of truth. Africa is present near the beginning in the line of Ham through Cush. Mizraim, and Put. It is present in civilization, in migration, in the ancient memory of nations. It is present where Abram flees in famine, present where Joseph rises, present where Moses is formed, present in the mixed multitude of the Exodus, present in the Cushite woman, whose place in Moses' life God does not permit others to despise, present in royal courts and prophetic rescues, present in the wisdom encounter between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, present in the age of empires through Taharka and the Kushite world, present in the refuge of the child Jesus, present on the road to Golgotha, present at Pentecost, present on the desert road where Isaiah opens and baptism follows. None of that means the Bible belongs to one continent. It means no continent can be written out of the story to satisfy the pride of another. The text is more demanding than that. It honors a shared origin. It tells a fractured history. It refuses easy innocence, and it keeps bringing the outsider nearer than the insiders expect. That pattern matters. Again and again, the Bible places the supposedly distant person closer to the center of grace. A widow from Zarephath, a Moabite woman in David's line, a Samaritan who proves neighbor, an Ethiopian who goes home baptized. The God of Scripture is always larger than the boundaries men draw to protect themselves. There is also a final humility in the story of Adam and Eve, and in the silence the text keeps about their appearance. So much later certainty was built on what Genesis never says. The first humans were made in the image of God, not in the image of any later civilization's portrait. The Bible's concern is vocation, relation, disobedience, exile, mercy. It does not offer racial icons for future empires to imitate. Human variety, with all its shades and faces, belongs inside the generosity of creation and the long history of migration, adaptation, and kinship. Difference is real. That lie did terrible work. It helped men baptize theft, rape, sale, forced labor, and inherited humiliation. It turned Canaan into Africa and prophecy into policy. It made many readers suspicious of the Bible itself because they met it first in the mouth of oppression. That history should not be handled lightly. Yet the answer to the abuse of the text is not to leave the text behind in disgust. It is to read it more truthfully than the abusers did. When that happens, the page begins to clear. Then Noah's tent no longer becomes the birthplace of racial myth. It becomes a warning about how easily shame, family fracture, and prophetic speech can be mishandled. Genesis 10 no longer becomes a chart of human value. It becomes an ancient testimony to shared origin and differentiated peoples. Egypt no longer becomes the proof of curse. It becomes a civilization God deals with, judges, uses, and enters through exile and refuge. Cush no longer becomes a synonym for distance from grace. It becomes one of the names gathered into prophetic hope. And Africa no longer stands outside the biblical drama, waiting to be admitted. It is already there. So the script returns at last to where it began. A tent, a father, a spoken curse, and the long shadow cast by a false reading. The shadow is real, but it is not final. The text itself is stronger than the distortion laid over it. It keeps saying what it said from the beginning. The curse is on Canaan, not Ham. The blessing after the flood reaches all Noah's sons. The nations spread from one family. African peoples are not biblical afterthoughts or targets of divine contempt. They are woven into the world of Scripture as builders, rulers, seekers, spouses, witnesses, and heirs of promise. And beyond every misused genealogy, beyond every empire that quoted Genesis while breaking human beings, the Bible leaves one image that cannot be bent into slavery. A countless company before God, no race enthroned above another, no people marked as born to serve. Every stolen hierarchy broken by a kingdom that judges the oppressor and gathers the far-off near. In that final light, the old lie withers. What remains is older than the lie and stronger than it. One humanity made by God, wounded by sin, scattered through history, and invited at last into a redemption wide enough for every nation.